With this lesson, we're going to be looking at the art of South and Southeast Asia after the year 1200. As we looked at in last lesson, much of the art before the year 1200 in India and Southeast Asia was made for sacred purposes, as people honored the three primary religions of the time, and that would be Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. Well, after the year 1200, we have also the inclusion of Islam, which came from the north, from Central Asia, brought in by the Mughals. This image that we're looking at here was built by a Mughal king. In fact, it was a tomb for his wife, for his favorite wife who died in childbirth. And I would bet it's probably something that you are very familiar with if you see it from a slightly different vantage point. Yes, this is the Taj Mahal, and we were looking at the interior of the Taj Mahal, which was originally called the Illuminated Tomb. And when we look back, it's easy to see where it got its name. It was a couple of hundred years after it was built that it was given this name, the Taj Mahal. What we're looking at here is the central structure of this tomb complex. On one side, out of our sight, is a mosque, and on the other side is a guest house. And this pool that we're looking at is designed to bring to mind the eternal hereafter. One of the things that's really interesting about this structure is that the man who built it, Shah Jahan, he also probably built it as a tomb for himself, as well as for his favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal, who died in childbirth. But he crossed the line between the sacred influences and himself as a human being, because he put these little minarets, which we usually only seen on mosques, around the Taj Mahal. He was a Mughal king who was one in a long line of kings who built this structure. Another interesting thing to note is that it's about exactly the same dimensions across as it is tall. Very symmetrical, very well proportioned. And then there's these 8 chambers on each side, which are called the 8 paradises. Of course, when we stack them up 2 stories tall, we have the 16 paradises. All around the archways and the doorways are inscriptions that are inlaid with calligraphy, and they were done by the foremost calligrapher of the time. And they're surrounded by these arabesques and floral patterns that are also inlaid, which means there's hollows in the stone. Spaces for the precious stones are then placed into the openings. It's a rather tricky process, and it requires a fine artisan to do it. Some of the precious stones that are inlaid here at the Taj Mahal include carnelian, agate, coral, turquoise, and jasper. And this is just on the outside of the structure. Well, this is the one architectural feature in India that's most familiar to a lot of people. It's really only one in a huge wealth of art and architecture that reflects the various influences of the time. Let's take a moment and look at the map. I always like to look at the maps and see where exactly we are. So by the year 1200, Buddhism had really declined in India, except for up in the northeast, which up in this area. And what happened up there with Buddhism was they actually developed universities and monasteries that drew monks from China, Korea, Japan, really from all over. But the rest of India didn't really have a lot of Buddhist action at the time. Also, around the year 1200, the Mughals came in from Central Asia, as I said, and Islam began to be a pretty strong influence. Now, in addition to the Buddhist centers up here in the northeast part of the country, Buddhism also spread down into Indonesia and Thailand, where it really had a strong foothold. What I'd like to do first is let's look at a bodhisattva that is from India. Here we have the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. This image, this sculpture, is from the Buddhist Tantric tradition, and they believed as part of their practice that they would visualize specific deities. So as a result, they have all these different aspects of bodhisattvas and of Buddhas that are represented by symbols, or you could call it iconographic features. In other words, we always know that if we see a bodhisattva holding a lotus flower, it's probably this particular deity. And the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara represents a compassion, a very profound compassion. Let's talk for a minute about what is a bodhisattva as compared to a Buddha. Bodhisattvas are said to represent people who have come to earth, received enlightenment, so they're almost to Buddhahood, but they choose to stay on the earth to help others, to find compassion and enlightenment. So this particular one, we know that he's this one deity, Avalokiteshvara, because of these things that we see on this sculpture. As I said before, one of them is the lotus petal. He also has a third eye, and that represents omniscience. Something interesting is up on his crown here is a specific Buddha that represents this spirit of compassion. And on his hand here, in the mudra of the open palm, we see a wheel. And that represents the Dharma, or you could call it right living. Another thing that we'll notice about the bodhisattvas, and you can see this as we go through the chapters in both China, Korea, Japan, and in this chapter, is that if it's a bodhisattva, they're dressed more regally. They're dressed in princely garments, whereas the Buddhas tend to have a monk's robe. And here also we can see that he's sitting in this posture, which is called the posture of royal ease. So throughout the time period that we're looking at, the practice of Jainism was relatively stable, although it's a religion that most people in the West may not have even heard of. Their primary belief is to live a life of nonviolence, and this could be seen as extreme in that they were vegetarians. They made a commitment not to kill living creatures, both the lay people that practice this religion and the monks. Now, because they were nonviolent, they tended not to be kings and rulers, because the very nature of being a ruler at that time meant that you probably had to fight a war here and there, and perhaps do violence to your enemies. So instead, many practitioners of Jainism turned out to be merchants and ministers. And because of this, many wealthy merchants were patrons of art and architecture in the Jain tradition. And here we have something that is from Mount Abu in Rajasthan. It's the ceiling of a temple that was dedicated to Luna Vasahi, who's, they had, in the Jain tradition, they had 24 patriarchs, or great rulers, and the very last one, the 24th, that's the person who really gave rise to the religion in about the year 500 BC. So this particular temple is dedicated to the 22nd patriarch. The thing to notice here is the delicacy of the ceiling, and even though it was made in 1200, really almost 1,000 years ago, this delicate carving has managed to remain to this day. The temple was built because of two brothers who were merchants who sponsored its building. Now, what we see in Buddhism in the time period that we're looking at here is that it rose to great prominence, and then about the year 900 it started to decline, and it declined rather strongly. But Jainism, on the other hand, it just maintained a steady presence in India throughout history. As Buddhism declined, the practice of Hinduism came to prominence. One of the features of Hinduism is celebrations. There is a lot of festivals. And what happened is that as Hinduism spread throughout India and increased in strength, there was a bit of a competition between kings to who could build the most beautiful temple and these vast temple complexes. What we saw in the architecture before 1200 was that they were creating these monumental temples. And after the year 1200, these gave way to these large complexes that could really allow for a lot of people to participate in the festivals. And what we're looking at here is the temple at Madurai, and it was built by the Nayak people in Tamil Nadu in South India. I'd like to show you another view which will help you to get a little perspective on it. Here we see this one that we were just looking at and a couple of other ones. What these are, they're actually gates, if you can imagine. That's a gateway into the temple complex. And as each generation of a king would come forward, they would maybe want to outdo the guy that had been king before him, their ancestors, and build an even greater uh, gateway or entrance into the temple complex. So here, if you look carefully, here's one, and here's one, and I believe there's one more back here, but the largest that we're looking at here is 160 feet tall. So think of a 16-story building. You can get a good perspective if you look at the teeny tiny people in the street below. Now these are covered with thousands and thousands of sculptures of deities that are richly painted. One of the things that you can see here in this image is the bright colors and the sort of festive feeling that we get from a lot of Hindu art and architecture. So now we're going to take a look at Islam and how it came into India, which first happened with merchants probably around the year 800. It wasn't until around the year 1200, though, that Islam really had a firm place. It established a foothold in India. This was centered around the northern city of Delhi. Here we're looking at one of the first mosques ever to be built in India, and it's called the Quwat-ul-Islam Mosque, and it was built in the city of Delhi by a couple of kings over a period of about 100 years. What we're particularly looking at is the minaret. And minarets are architectural features that are built around mosques, and they're designed for the traditional call to prayer that is done 5 times a day. Now this particular minaret kind of amuses me because it's too tall for that. It's 237 feet, and just to take it to my typical approximation, think about a 24-story building. I mean, that's really up there. I'd love to see the view from up on top, but it wouldn't be really that much use. Wouldn't be of that much use for doing the call to prayer. Another thing that's interesting about this is that the builders took stone and other items from Hindu and Jain religious structures, and they used those in the building of this minaret. So this was really the first that we see of the Islamic architecture in India, and built right around the year 1200. So after the year 1200, there's a series of sultans or kings that come to India from Central Asia and continue to expand upon this architectural tradition. And it becomes a unique art form in India because these rulers, they bring with them the influences from Persia, but then they also incorporate Indian influences such as the fine stone masonry and stone carving traditions. Now, one really important thing that happens with the influence of the Mughals, of the sultans, and the Islamic architecture is the introduction of arches rather than post and lintel construction. And we'll look at that more in a moment. But first, what in the world are we looking at here? First, let's talk about some history. Long about 1526, there was a king that came in, and he was nicknamed Babur the Lion because he was a warrior, but he took over territory that went all the way from Delhi in northern India up into Afghanistan, and that all became an Islamic stronghold. Well, he was succeeded by a couple of kings, and the third king was a man named Akbar. What he did was he established an atmosphere of tolerance within his kingdom. He loved discourse. He loved to encourage the arts. In particular, he really liked painting. He supported painters, and a great painting tradition was established after his rule. But as he was getting older and he became worried about who was going to succeed him on the throne, he decided to go see a Sufi mystic named Chisti. And the Sufi mystic foretold that a prince would be born and that would be his successor. And when this proved to be true, well, Akbar built a temple for Chisti. He built a tomb for him and then a complex where he lived for quite a period of time. Now, the Chisti was from the Sufi tradition, which simply means the mystical tradition, and you actually find that in many religions, but it's based in the Islamic tradition in this case. So in the book, we have a picture. I wanted to show this picture. This is the entire temple complex, the tomb complex that Akbar built at the site of Chisti's tomb. And then he had his personal living quarters, an audience hall on one side, and here we have the picture from the book. What's interesting about this is you can visualize that up here on top is where he would sit and receive people below. So it has a sort of a psychological impact in that he is directly above the people that are petitioning him, but also there's a level of safety. He's separated from the crowds in a way that would keep him safe as people came to discuss matters with him. All right, let's look a little bit at post and lintel and the arch. Typically, the arches are talked about when we study the Roman Empire, but since we're not studying that, it's important to go over it here. First, let's look at post and lintel construction. Post and lintel construction, remember that term. Lintel is spelled L-I-N-T-E-L in this case. The easiest way to understand this kind of construction is to think about a door frame. And as there's a cross piece on a door frame, here we have a cross piece in construction. Now, the Egyptians used it. It's been used throughout history, and it's a really valid construction form. However, with post and lintel, you have to put a post fairly often, and you can't really have large openings. However, once you move to the arch, where you have the stone in the center to take some of the weight, then architects can span much larger distances. And if you take an arch and you move it around into a circle, you have a dome. And these are two very important introductions that the Mughals, the sultans, introduced into Indian architecture. Akbar's love of painting is reflected in this rather busy painting to our eyes, but it's him inspecting the construction at Fatehpur Sikri. And here we can see he's probably right there, and he's looking at the workers, and they're really demonstrating the stone construction that was in use at that time. This is a page from his biography that was created to, show that what we would call probably a biopic, to show all the great things that he did in his life. And the importance of it is to first note the difference in style than the style of Western painting. One thing we see is that there's no linear perspective. Things are just sort of stacked up rather than receding in the distance. Also, this is sort of, you could say it's sort of a busy composition, but let's look at another painting that came after that's quite different. And this next painting has strong historical and symbolic significance. Now, this painting is significant for a couple of reasons. First off, it's really a beautiful, simplistic representation. In other words, it's not a busy composition, and it's really well rendered. But there's a story to this painting. If you look on the left, you see this guy named Shah Abbas, and on the right, you see Jahangir. And Jahangir is the main figure. So if you look at it at first glance, it's these two guys hugging, saying, "Oh, we're friends," right? But if you look more closely, let me tell you the story, and then you can see what's really going on. Okay, so the guy on the left, Shah Abbas, had been given the city, his ancestors had been given the city of Kandahar in Afghanistan, which was a very prosperous city. But then the Mughals came in and they took it over. So Shah Abbas came along, the guy in red, and he said, I want my city back. And he took it, while the Mughals were busy elsewhere. The armies were engaged in another battle. So basically, he took back this city kind of in a little bit of a sneaky way. So the man, the larger man on the right, had this painting done and then sent it to him. So let's analyze it a little bit. You have a lion and a lamb that they're standing on. And it looks almost like a map of the world beneath that. So the guy, it's really about Jahangir showing his dominance. Notice how he's centered in the middle of the sun, with there is actually a moon beneath the sun, and how as he hugs the other guy, he's definitely the stronger of the two, and he's the one that's standing on the lion, whereas Shah Abbas is on the lamb. So it's as if to say, here my friend, here is a gift, and let it be a reminder of you not to push this power struggle any further. So with this image, we're going to end part 1, and we'll come back and wrap it up with part 2. Thanks for listening.